A week after New Year's, the world had already moved on from the glitter, but Colin Mercer still felt stuck in the slow aftermath, where the lights come down and the bills stay up. The cold didn't arrive with pretty snow, just a hard wind that found every gap around the windows of a small rental and made the heater cycle too often. In the kitchen, a magnet held a school notice about a science trip deposit. Beside it was an estimate from a mechanic with a red circle around the total, the kind of number that turns a working car into a constant question. Colin was 37, broad-shouldered in a worn work jacket, with the careful eyes of a man who checks everything twice because he cannot afford surprises. Sophie, 11 and stubbornly cheerful, had started pretending she didn't notice when he cut corners, but he heard it anyway in the pauses when she asked for something small and then added, "It's okay, Dad." Before he could answer, he'd promised her the science trip, because it was the kind of thing that made school feel bigger than their neighborhood, and because a promise from a parent is sometimes the only stable thing a child can hold. That morning, he stood at the sink with cold water running over his hands and watched his breath fog the glass, doing quiet math until it felt like the room had shrunk around him. Colin hadn't planned on becoming a single dad. It simply kept showing up until temporary became the new normal. Sophie's mom had left 2 years earlier, not with shouting match, but with a slow unraveling that ended in a suitcase and a message that said she needed to start over somewhere else. Colin didn't tell people that part in detail, because details invited opinions, and he didn't have room for opinions when he needed groceries and school pickups to happen on time. He worked maintenance at a community college during the day, and he took overtime whenever the supervisor offered it, crawling under boilers and replacing broken fixtures while students walked past without looking. Twice a month, he also did weekend shifts at a warehouse, the kind of work that left his hands cracked and his back tight, but paid cash fast enough to patch holes. Janine Booker, an older neighbor with a no-nonsense bun and a soft spot for Sophie, watched his daughter when his shifts ran late, accepting payment only in the form of repaired door hinges and snow shoveling. Colin hated owing anyone, even kind people, yet he accepted help because the alternative was Sophie alone after school, and he refused to build her childhood around his pride. The idea that change his week arrived the way most real ideas do, without drama, in the stale air of a break room. Colin was microwaving leftover chili when Troy Kincaid, a forklift operator with a busted knuckle and an endless stream of side hustle stories, mentioned a storage auction happening Saturday at a place just outside town. Troy didn't pitch it like a miracle. He described it like an option. He bought units before, sometimes losing money, sometimes pulling out clean merchandise that resold quickly, and he said the smartest buyers weren't thrill seekers, they were patient. Colin listened with the guarded interest of someone who cannot afford to be naive, asking questions about rules and deadlines instead of treasure. Troy explained you only get a doorway look. You can't touch anything, and you have to clear the space fast after purchase. He also said something that stuck because it was practical, not motivational. Some units look like chaos, but some look like work in progress, and work in progress usually means someone had a system. That night, after Sophie fell asleep with paperback open on her chest, Colin sat at the kitchen table under a buzzing light and searched storage auction listings with the same seriousness he used when he compared insurance rates. He wasn't hunting a jackpot. He was hunting a narrow path to breathing room. He found a listing for Unit 207 at Cedar Ridge Storage after midnight, when the house was quiet enough to hear the heater click. The facility photos were dim and strictly from the doorway, but they showed enough to make Colin's pulse change. The unit looked unusually orderly for something abandoned, with a folded hand trucked near the wall, a wrapped metal shelf, and a work table pushed to one side, as if someone meant to return the next day. The back half was blocked by a single hulking shape, something boxed and banded so tightly it read as one solid mass rather than stacked clutter, the edges squared off beneath layers of taped cardboard. It wasn't the kind of thing a person casually stores for fun, and it wasn't the kind of thing you can toss into a trunk on impulse, which made Colin think two opposite thoughts at once. Either it was worthless bulk someone couldn't move, or it was bulk someone didn't want strangers digging through. The starting bid was low enough to tempt him and high enough to hurt if he was wrong. Colin opened his budgeting app, checked an emergency envelope, and set a hard ceiling that he wrote on a sticky note and pressed the table, a number that protected rent and heat, even if it disappointed Sophie. He promised himself he would walk away if bidding turned into ego, because ego was expensive and his daughter didn't get to choose his risks. Saturday morning arrived gray and sharp, the kind of cold that makes metal sting through gloves. Colin dropped Sophie at Janine's with a bag of snacks and her science notebook, telling her he had to run an errand because he didn't want her hopes tied to something so uncertain. Cedar Ridge Storage sat behind a chain-link fence with rows of roll-up doors like blank faces and a small office window glowing under fluorescent light. Inside, the manager, Maribel Cross, spoke the rules in a calm voice that carried authority without attitude, and she watched bidders the way someone watches weather, expecting sudden changes. Colin paid the deposit, pinned a bidder number to his jacket, and stayed quiet as the group moved from door to door. Most units looked like old furniture and forgotten boxes, the kind of leftovers that would take days to sort and still not pay for the effort. A few regulars, including Reggie Vaughn, a thin man in a knit cap who seemed to know everyone without needing to bid fast on power tools and sealed appliances. Colin kept his hands down, letting the rhythm of the auction settle his nerves. When they reached 207 and the door rattled upward, he saw that the photo hadn't exaggerated. The space still felt paused, not abandoned, and that heavy box mass at the back made the unit feel smaller than it should have. He didn't stare like a tourist, because he didn't want to broadcast interest, but his eyes caught one detail that didn't fit the neatness. A strip of glossy packing tape hanging loose from a lower corner of the big carton, as if someone had sealed it in a hurry. The bidding began sluggish, then woke up in small jumps, and Colin felt the moment where caution and necessity collided inside him. He held to his ceiling through 2 counteroffers, ignoring the way his chest tightened each time someone raised a hand, because he had promised himself discipline would be his safety net. When the crowd hesitated, when the unit's strange bulk made even confident buyers pause, Colin lifted his hand and placed a final bid that sat just below his limit, the number he'd written on his sticky note, like a line drawn in ink. There was a beat where someone might have pushed him higher, and he held his breath, already rehearsing the choice to step back. Then Maribel's gavel snapped down, and the sound echoed off the corridor doors, quick and final. Colin didn't feel triumphant. He felt exposed, as if he had just admitted to the whole row that he needed this to work. Maribel handed him the receipt and a key that felt too small for the weight it represented. And as he turned away, he caught Maribel's eyes flick toward the office phone like she was expecting it to ring. Colin told himself that was nothing, just routine, but on his walk back to the gate, he noticed a dark SUV idling beyond the fence line, parked at an angle that didn't match anyone leaving. The driver didn't wave or move, and Colin didn't stop to look longer than a second, because the safest way to handle a stare is not to stare back. He drove home with the key heavy in his pocket, knowing he bought more than a storage unit. He bought the question of what was inside that box mass, and why anyone might care who owned it now. The next morning, Colin Mercer came back to Cedar Ridge Storage in full daylight, because daylight felt like a kind of insurance. The sky was pale and tight, the post, New Year cold that doesn't sparkle, just bites, and the concrete lanes held a thin grit of salt that squeaked under his boots. He had packed his truck the way he packed for any job where mistakes cost money, a roll of painter's tape, a thick marker, nitrile gloves under heavier work gloves, zip bags, a flashlight, and a small step stool that barely fit behind the seat. Before he even turned into the gate, he checked his mirrors twice, half expecting that dark SUV from the auction to appear like a bad thought returning. But the road behind him held only commuters and a school bus. That should have calmed him, yet it didn't, because calm is hard when you spent years learning that quiet problems can still break you. He parked close to the office cameras, walked in with his receipt folder tucked under his arm, and kept his voice polite and brief. Maribel Cross slid him the access sheet and reminded him of the deadline in the same tone a nurse uses when she's being kind but cannot bend rules. Colin nodded, signed, and asked one question he tried to keep casual. Had anyone asked about Unit 207 after the auction? Maribel's mouth tightened just enough to answer before words did. Then she said, "A man called, wanted to know who bought it and when you'd be here." She didn't say it like a threat, but she didn't say it like gossip either, and Colin felt the muscles in his neck go hard. He asked if she gave anything away. "No names," she said, but he tried to make it sound official. Colin didn't press for more. because he didn't want to turn worry into a story everyone repeated. Yet as he walked down the lane toward his unit, he heard her add, almost as an afterthought, "If you see anything that looks like it shouldn't be here, don't be a hero." The advice landed heavier than it should have, because he wasn't trying to be heroic. He was trying to get his daughter to spring without a stack of past due notices sitting between them. Unit 207 looked ordinary from a distance, just another blue roll-up door among dozens, but up close it carried that same pause feeling Colin had noticed at the auction. The lock was intact, the metal unbent, yet the air in the lane felt too still, as if the row listened. He filmed a slow sweep with his phone before he touched anything, narrating dates and unit number in a low voice the way he would document a broken boiler panel for his supervisor. Then he unlocked the padlock and lifted the door a foot at a time, letting it rattle upward without a dramatic yank. The smell that spilled out was cold cardboard, dust, and something faintly oily, like a toolbox stored too long. The front of the unit held practical things: a wrapped metal shelf, a folded dolly, 2 brown boxes strapped with twine, and a narrow work table with a lamp that didn't have a shade. The back half was dominated by that massive cardboard carton he'd seen in the listing photo. Only now, he could tell it wasn't one box at all, but a box built out of boxes. Thick sheets of corrugated had been layered, taped, and banded with black straps until the whole thing looked like freight that had decided to become a wall. The loose strip of glossy tape he'd spotted at the auction still hung from the bottom edge like a tongue, and it bothered him in a precise way, because it suggested a last-minute seal, not long-term storage. Colin laid painter's tape on the floor and labeled zones in thick marker. Keep, sell, trash, hold, because chaos becomes manageable the moment you give it borders. He told himself he was over-preparing, but he'd learned over-preparing is what people call it when they've never lost sleep over $20. The stakes were simple and sharp. If this unit was junk, he'd be eating that bid for months. If it held value, he needed to extract it without letting anyone else's urgency shove him into a mistake. He started with the brown boxes because they were the most believable reason anyone would rent a unit like this. The first box held packing supplies arranged with a strange neatness, bubble wrap sheets folded into rectangles, foam corners stacked like dominoes, zip ties, silica packets, and a label maker with its cartridge half used. The second box was heavier, and when he cut the twine, he found folded moving blankets on top and a slim binder beneath them, sealed in a clear bag, as if the person who packed it didn't trust the air. The binder cover had only 2 things, a handwritten number and 1 word in block letters: index. Colin's stomach tightened as he flipped it open, because the pages inside weren't random notes or receipts. They were grids, case numbers, short descriptions, dates, and locations written in a clean, restrained style that felt more like a logbook than a reseller's inventory. Some entries were ordinary enough: winter coats, assorted sizes, foreign currency mixed, unclaimed jewelry small, but others made his mouth go dry. Storage media, secured, documents sensitive, keys mixed, and phone sealed. It was the same unsettling feeling he got when he opened an electrical panel and saw wires that had been modified by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The binder didn't explain motive, but it proved intent. This wasn't a family dumping clutter. This was a system. For a moment, Colin thought of the way Sophie binge-watched calm sorting videos and laughed when he paused to read labels. She joked once, in her 11-year-old way, that if you want the good channels to keep showing up, you hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment so the algorithm knows you mean it. Colin had rolled his eyes at the time, but standing in front of a stranger's meticulous index, he felt the darker version of that idea. Someone had been trying to keep things from disappearing, and they'd done it with labels and lists instead of applause. Only after he photographed the index pages did he commit to opening the big carton, because the carton was the heart of the unit, and hearts are where you get hurt. He didn't rip it apart. He cut one band at a time, peeled tape in long, steady pulls, and opened a seam like he was unzipping a winter coat. The first layer was cardboard padding, and more moving blankets, then smaller boxes packed tight, then a dense block of identical brushed aluminum cases stacked in columns. The sight made him stop breathing for a second, not because it looked like treasure, but because it looked like work measured in hours and decisions. The cases were uniform in size, each shut with heavy clasps, their surfaces scuffed in different spots, as if they had traveled separately before being gathered into one place. Some carried faint airline stickers scraped nearly clean. A few had old baggage barcodes cut in half. Colin pulled one case from the middle row and set it on the tarp he'd laid down, keeping the opening within the unit, so the lane couldn't see much. The latches clicked open with a crispness that felt wrong for abandoned property, and the lid rose to reveal foam inserts cut into compartments like a presentation kit. Inside were not piles of cash or anything cinematic. Inside were small ordinary items wrapped in tissue and labeled with careful notes. A men's wedding band in a tiny sleeve, marked with terminal number and a date. Pearl earrings in a velvet pouch marked hotel lobby not claimed. A child's inhaler still in a prescription box, name blacked out. A holiday card addressed to Grandpa. The address line trimmed away as if someone refused to let it become a weapon. Colin's throat tightened in a way that surprised him, because he had expected commerce, not tenderness. He pictured a father on a trip patting his pockets, realizing the ring was gone, and the image hit too close to the way Colin sometimes patted his coat pocket to check for Sophie's spare house key. The unit wasn't feeling like a bargain anymore. It was feeling like a museum of other people's missing minutes. He kept going because stopping would let emotion turn into panic, and panic make sloppy choices. The next case held foreign currencies sorted by country in small envelopes, each labeled with a location that sounded like airports, bus depots, train stations, the in-between places where lives cross and drop pieces. Another case held winter coats and gloves sealed in vacuum bags, tagged by size, clean and ready as if someone planned to hand them back to the right owners on the right day. Colin tried to frame it in practical terms. Coats meant resale value, currency meant conversion, jewelry meant appraisal, but the binder's tone kept pulling him away from profit and toward purpose. Whoever did this had written down where things were found, not just what they were worth, and that detail didn't match the instinct of the thief. Colin started adding his own tiny system on top of theirs, placing a pencil mark on the edge of each latch he opened so he could track what he'd touched, and slipping a time-stamped sticky note inside each lid to record when it was checked. It felt excessive until he remembered Maribel's warning about the caller who sounded official, and the way that dark SUV had waited outside the fence line at the auction. He didn't want to end up explaining himself to anyone with nothing but his own word. In the quiet moments between cases, he listened to the lane sounds beyond the roll-up. A lock clanging, tires crunching gravel, a distant engine idling too long. Once, footsteps passed and paused near his unit, and Colin's shoulders rose without permission. He didn't step out to confront anyone. He rolled the door down halfway, tightened his grip on the case he was holding, and waited until the footsteps moved on. His fear wasn't dramatic. It was parental, the kind that measures danger by whether it can reach your child. The entry that kept tugging at him was storage media secured, because media didn't belong in a casual lost and found project unless there was a reason. It took him several minutes to locate the right case in the carton stack, because the numbers were small and the foam rows all looked similar at a glance. When he finally found it, he felt the weight difference immediately. Dense, deliberate. He set it down, checked that his phone was recording, and opened it with care that bordered on reverence. Inside were hard drives and thumb drives arranged in phone channels, each marked with a number and a city name, nothing more, and beneath them an anti-static bag sealed with a small card tucked inside. The card was written in block letters, steady and unshowy. Do not plug into a personal computer. Use a clean device. Copy before viewing. Colin's mouth went dry, because he wasn't a tech expert, but he knew enough from workplace training to understand the basic truth. People don't write warnings like that for family photos. He didn't touch the drives. He photographed the labels, the warning card, the foam layout, and the case number, then closed it and slid it deeper into a unit behind heavier cases where it couldn't be grabbed quickly. He told himself he'd ask Troy for a contact who knew computers, or he'd bring it to someone official if it crossed a line he couldn't defend. He just needed time to think, and time was the one thing life never gave him for free. As he stood back up, his knee cracked in the cold, and he felt suddenly aware of how alone he was in that metal lane with the door half open, and a unit full of items that seemed to matter to someone who wasn't here anymore. He saved the taped corner of the carton for last, because the tape felt like a warning flag, and he didn't want to touch the warning flag until he understood the map. The taped area led him to a single case on the bottom row that sat a fraction forward, as if it had been pulled out and pushed back without being fully reseated. The latch was wrapped in glossy brown packing tape, newer than everything else, and the edges were pressed down with a fingernail. Colin stared at it longer than he meant to, then forced himself into action the same way he did when Sophie spiked a fever, and his brain wanted to spin. He positioned the case on the dolly, rolled it onto the tarp, and peeled the tape slowly so it wouldn't tear into useless fragments. Underneath, the latch popped free with a small sigh of metal. Inside, the foam insert held only 2 items: a black notebook sealed in clear plastic and an older phone wrapped in a microfiber cloth, placed dead center like they were the point of the whole system. Colin lifted the notebook first because paper felt safe in electronics, and through the plastic sleeve, he could read the first line without opening it. The sentence was simple and heavy enough to change the air. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back." His hands went cold despite his gloves, and a tight ache moved up into his throat because he heard the voice behind the words. Not dramatic, just resigned. He set the notebook down carefully, reached for the wrapped phone, and told himself it was probably dead, probably nothing, probably just an old device stored with a note. Then the phone screen lit by itself, bright against the foam, and an incoming call appeared without a name or number. Just 2 words that made Colin's stomach drop as if the floor shifted under him. Unknown caller. The phone kept glowing the foam cradle, bright enough to make the brushed aluminum look like a stage light, and Colin Mercer felt 2 instincts collide inside his chest. One was the human urge to answer, to end the uncertainty in a single word, and the other was the instinct that had carried him through 3 years of solo parenting. Never let a stranger pull you into a corner. He held his own phone over the screen and filmed everything. The unknown caller label, the time, the signal bars, the cracked corner of the old device, because he needed proof more than he needed a voice. The vibration stopped, started again, then stopped for good, leaving a tiny voicemail icon that appeared as quietly as a bruise. Colin didn't play it there, not with the roll-up half open and the storage lane a few steps away. He wrapped the phone back into its microfiber cloth, slid the sealed notebook beside it, and closed the case until both latches clicked with a finality that steadied his breathing. The message on the notebook's first page kept pressing against his mind like a cold thumbprint. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back," and he hated how quickly his thoughts jumped to worst-case images. He forced himself into steps instead of spirals, because steps were how you keep your child safe. He photographed the case number, the tape remnants, and the exact position of the case within the stack, then pushed it back into the carton, so the surface looked unchanged. He rolled the unit door down to chest height for a moment, listened to the lane sounds, and realized the scariest part wasn't the call. The scariest part was what the call implied. Someone out there still cared enough to try reaching that phone, which meant Colin had walked into a living thread, not a dead end. He moved like a man carrying glass, careful and quiet, and he chose what to remove the way you choose what to grab in a fire. The media case stayed where it was, because it felt like a magnet for trouble and he didn't have the tools to handle it safely. He took the index binder, because it was a map, and he took one low-value personal items case, because it gave him a reason to explain his actions without sounding like he was hiding anything. The sealed notebook, unread beyond the first sentence, went into his jacket pocket, close to his ribs, because paper disappears easily, and it already felt like a last message that mattered. At the edge of the lane, he looked back once and saw the big carton sitting like a swallowed secret, black straps hanging loose where he cut them. He locked the unit with the facility's standard padlock, then added his own new disc lock, the kind that leaves very little metal exposed. It was not a perfect shield, but it was a signal that the unit was not a casual target anymore. When he walked past the office window, Mary Belcross watched him with the sharp, measuring look of someone who had seen problems arrive quietly before. Colin didn't tell her about the call. Not yet, but he asked if the facility had a way to note buyer request staff presence when a unit was opened. Mary Bell nodded and typed something into her log, then slid him a card with the non-emergency number on it in the same smooth motion. "If anyone shows up claiming they're authorized," she said, voice low, "ask for paperwork install." Colin nodded, because that matched his own instincts, and as he left the office, he felt the smallest relief of not being the only adult in the room who understood that calm is not the same thing as safe. He did not drive home, because home was where Sophie would be in a few hours, and he refused to deliver fear to his own doorstep. Colin drove toward the busiest part of town, past a supermarket with leftover New Year decorations drooping in the windows, and a coffee shop packed with people shaking winter out of their shoulders. He chose a bank on Ridge Avenue because it had cameras, steady foot traffic, and the kind of quiet authority that makes strangers think twice. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of floor polish and pine-scented cleaner, and a tired wreath hung on the counter, like someone forgot to take it down. He asked for a small safe deposit box in the most ordinary voice he could manage, because ordinary gets processed quickly. The teller didn't blink. She walked him to the forms with practiced calm and led him through the heavy vault door into a cooler hallway where sound died against thick walls. Colin placed the index binder and the sealed notebook inside the box, along with a folded sheet where he wrote the date, the unit number, and one line that felt ridiculous and necessary at the same time. Old phone rang inside seal case. Unknown caller. He watched the drawer slide shut and felt his breathing deepen. Because a locked vault was not courage, but it was distance, and distance was a kind of safety. Outside in the parking lot, he sat in his truck for a minute with both hands on the wheel, scanning mirrors without wanting to. Then he forced himself to drive to his next stop before fear could turn into paralysis. At the police station, he chose the front desk, not because he wanted sirens, but because he needed a record that existed outside his own head. He kept his story simple and factual. He bought a storage unit at auction, found organized property that might belong to others, discovered a case of computer drives labeled with a warning not to plug them in, and an old phone inside a tape case rang while he was present. He mentioned the caller who asked the manager for his identity, and the way the unit's contents felt like a system, not random junk. The officer behind the desk listened with the tired patience of someone who has heard 100 strange stories and knows which ones are nonsense and which ones have teeth. He didn't laugh, and that mattered. He gave Colin an incident number, advised him not to meet anyone privately if someone contacted him, and suggested that if Colin believed the unit contained evidence of theft, he could request a property crimes detective consult. Colin didn't make it sound like a conspiracy. He described it like a man who wanted to do the right thing without getting crushed by it. Before he left, he asked one practical question. Should he move the drives? The officer's answer was simple and grounded. Don't touch what you don't understand, he said. Secure what you can, document everything, and keep your kid out of it. Colin walked back to his truck feeling no happier, but steadier, because steadiness is what you get when a worry becomes a file instead of a secret. That afternoon at home, he kept his face neutral the way parents do when they have to protect a child from adult weather. Sophie came out of her room in a sweatshirt that swallowed her hands, hair still damp from a shower, and asked if he had found anything cool, yet like the storage unit was a scavenger hunt. Colin told her he found mostly organized stuff, and that he was going slowly because the unit was bigger than it looked. He made grilled cheese and canned tomato soup because the smell of warm bread makes a kitchen feel safer than it is. And he listened to Sophie talk about school and the drama of a group project while his mind kept circling that first sentence on the sealed notebook. Later, when she went to her room to video chat with a friend, Colin sat at the table with his receipt folder and wrote a timeline on a legal pad. Auction time, manager conversation. First entry. Case numbers opened, media case located, tape case opened, phone rang, bank vault created, police incident number. It was a kind of boring list that keeps a person from getting talked into mistakes, and he wrote it with slow care because he'd learned how quickly stories get twisted when paperwork is missing. He also pulled up the storage facility's website and paid for an upgraded unit insurance rider, not because he believed it would save him from a determined thief, but because it created another layer of documentation. The more he worked, the more he noticed a cold truth settling under his ribs. Whoever packed that unit had planned for pressure. The warning card, the tape case, the index entries that sounded like control categories. None of it was designed for a man like Colin to have a casual, profitable weekend. It was designed for custody, transfer, and someone trying to keep control over what moved where. The next day, Colin returned to Cedar Ridge Storage during the busiest window because he didn't want empty lanes and long shadows. He asked Maribel to note in the log that he was entering Unit 207 for inventory and documentation. Then he requested, politely, firmly, whether staff could be within sight for the first 10 minutes. Maribel didn't argue. She grabbed her keys and walked down the lane with him in a brisk, capable way people do when they understand that safety is a shared responsibility. The unit door looked intact, but Colin's stomach tightened as soon as the lock came into view. The disc lock was still there, yet the metal around the latch showed a faint fresh scuff, the kind of mark a tool leaves when it slips. Inside, the air smelled the same, but the floor near the threshold held a strip of glossy brown packing tape placed too neatly to be trash, centered like someone wanted it noticed. Colin filmed before stepping in, because if he learned anything in the last 48 hours, it was that emotions lie and video doesn't. He rolled the door down halfway to limit the lane's view, then walked straight to the carton stack and checked the bottom row first. One case set slightly forward again, the same subtle look here posture, and Maribel's jaw tightened when she saw it. That wasn't like that yesterday, was it? She asked quietly, and Colin's throat went dry because the question was already an answer. He didn't touch the forward case yet. He checked the stack where the media case had been hidden behind heavier cases. The clean rectangle of empty space hit him like a punch. The media case was gone. Not scattered, not swapped, just removed with enough care that the rest of the stack still looked almost normal from the doorway. Colin felt a shameful wave of self-blame rise, the thought that he should have taken the drives first, and he crushed it by forcing his mind back into action. He photographed the empty space, the surrounding latch marks, and the tape strip near the door. Then he closed the unit and walked with Maribel back to the office without looking over his shoulder more than twice. Maribel pulled up the camera feeds they had, and the grainy angle showed trucks and renters, but left gaps that made Colin's skin prickle. She checked gate logs for Colin's code and found no entry after his last visit, which meant someone used another method, another code, or something that didn't log cleanly. Maribel made a call to the facility owner to report suspected unauthorized access, and Colin called a non-emergency line again to update his instant report with the missing media case and the evidence of tampering. The officer told him to keep the unit locked and to avoid confrontation, and Colin agreed, because confrontation was exactly what someone like this would want, an argument without witnesses, a moment they could twist into blame. When he stepped back outside, the winter air felt sharper, and the ordinary sound of a shopping cart rattling across the lot felt unreal, compared to the heavy fact sitting in his chest. Someone had come back for information, not merchandise, and they had done it carefully enough to avoid a simple record. Colin was still standing near his truck when his phone vibrated, and the sound snapped through him like a wire pulled tight. He looked down and saw a text from an unknown number with no greeting and no name, just a short line that made the bottom drop out of his stomach. Tonight, after closing, bring the binder. His first impulse was to throw the phone, not because he wanted to be dramatic, but because he hated how easily someone could reach into his life through a screen. He didn't answer. He took a screenshot, emailed it to himself, then showed it to Maribel, who went pale in a controlled way that told Colin she understood exactly what that message meant. The stranger didn't just know the unit's contents existed. The stranger knew Colin had taken the binder, or believed he had, and they were trying to drag him into darkness where cameras and witnesses disappear. Colin's mind flashed to Sophie's face at breakfast, to the way she pretended not to worry when he worked late, and he felt anger rise alongside fear, clean and focused. He told Maribel he was going straight to the police station with a message, and he asked her to print gate logs and preserve camera footage from the last 48 hours before anything overwrote. Maribel nodded and started moving with brisk purpose. Because older facilities run on habits, and good managers know when to treat a situation like more than customer service. Colin climbed into his truck and checked his mirrors again, and this time a dark SUV sat 2 rows over with its engine idling, not close enough to accuse, not far enough to ignore. He didn't stare at it. He drove out slowly, turned the opposite direction home, and felt his pulse hammer as he realized the story had crossed the line. If someone was willing to steal the media case and then demand a nighttime meeting, what exactly were they afraid Colin might do with the binder? And what would they do next if he refused? Colin didn't drive home after he saw the text, because home was the one place he refused to turn into a battlefield. He went straight to the police station with the message still glowing on his screen, his stomach tight in a way that made the steering wheel feel slick under his palms. The lobby was bright and ordinary, with a bulletin board full of community flyers and a tired potted plant that had survived too many winters, and that normality almost made him angry. He showed the desk officer his incident number, then the screenshot, then the short video he'd taken of the unit before he touched anything, and he kept his voice flat, because panic turns details into mush. A detective from Property Crimes, Sloan Fitch, came out to speak with him, older than he expected and calm in a way that didn't perform kindness but delivered it. She asked what it had removed, where he had stored it, and whether he had replied to the unknown number. Colin told her the binder and notebook were in a safe deposit box, that the drives were never removed, and that he had not answered anything, because answering was how people get pulled into private deals with no witnesses. Fitch didn't lecture him. She nodded once and said he had done the 3 things most people skip. Document first, avoid contact, and create a paper trail. Then she said the part that made Colin's throat go dry, because it turned his worry into a plan with sharp edges. If someone demanded a meeting after closing, it meant they believed darkness and empty lanes gave them control, and the quickest way to take that control back was to let them show up expecting one thing and find something else. Fitch made it clear she wasn't promising a movie-style takedown, because life doesn't pay out that clean, but she did tell him they could use the message to start building probable cause, especially since a media case had already been stolen and there were signs of forced access. Colin sat in that hard plastic chair and listened while she laid out options like tools on a table. And for the first time since the unknown phone rang inside the phone cradle, he felt the smallest shift from helpless to focused. The plan had one non-negotiable rule. Sophie could not be anywhere near it. Colin hated that rule and loved it at the same time, because it was a truth he already lived by, the one that made him a single father instead of a man who chased revenge. He texted a neighbor he trusted, a retired teacher named Marin who had watched Sophie grow up on that street and treated every kid like they mattered, and he asked if Sophie could spend the evening there under the excuse of New Year's movie night. He didn't tell Sophie the full story, because he refused to hand her the kind of fear that burrows into teenagers and turns them sharp, but he also did lie in a way that would insult her intelligence. He told her he had to handle a paperwork mess connected to the auction, and that he needed her to be somewhere safe and boring for a few hours. Sophie studied his face, saw what he couldn't hide, and nodded without argument, which somehow hurt more than if she had fought him. When she grabbed her hoodie and headed next door, she paused at the doorframe and said one small sentence that landed heavier than advice. "Don't be a hero, Dad." Colin promised he wouldn't, and he meant it, because heroes take risks for pride and parents take risks for outcomes. He drove back toward the storage facility with Detective Fitch's card on the passenger seat and a hollow space in his chest where his daughter's presence usually kept him anchored. Before anything happened after closing, Fitch insisted on daylight work, because daylight keeps people honest and keeps cameras useful. Colin met her and Maribel at the facility near mid-afternoon, when renters were hauling decorations and extra boxes and the office stayed staffed. Fitch walked the lane like she had done it 1,000 times, slow and unobtrusive, seeing what other people ignored. She inspected the lock scuff, photographed the tape strip placed at the threshold, and noted the missing rectangle in the case stack where the media case had been. She didn't open random cases, and she didn't touch the tape case, because she wasn't there to satisfy curiosity. She was there to preserve integrity. Colin felt a strange relief watching someone professional treat his fear like something that could be measured instead of something that owned him. Fitch asked Maribel direct questions about gate fobs, legacy codes, maintenance access, and cameras, and Maribel answered with the practical honesty of someone who loved the facility but knew its weak spots. There were older fobs that still worked, Maribel admitted. Some issued years ago and never returned, and the back lane camera did have a blind angle at the bottom of the doors. Fitch didn't blame her. She just wrote it down, because blame doesn't protect anyone. Then Fitch asked a question that made Colin's stomach tighten for a different reason. Had anyone ever seen the previous renter in uniform, with badges, with anything that suggested a job around transit property? Maribel hesitated, then said the renter used to come late, always near closing, carrying cases like those, and he once joked about recovery lots the way other people joke about office coffee. Colin realized the unit had always been a hinge between worlds. Lost property, bulk auctions, unclaimed freight, and that someone else had decided the hinge belonged to them. Fitch kept the sting simple on purpose, because complicated plans break in real life. Colin would not meet anyone alone. No dark lane. No empty office. No walking out with a binder tucked under his arm like an offering. Instead, They would create a controlled scene during the last busy hour, when the gate still logged normal traffic and the lane had witnesses without being crowded. Colin would return to the unit with a sealed plastic tote that looked official enough to tempt a greedy person into thinking it held what they wanted. Fitch and a uniformed officer would be nearby without announcing themselves, and the moment anyone tried to make contact or reach for property, it would shift from a private pressure play into a documented incident. Colin asked the obvious question, the one that tasted like acid in his mouth. What if they went to his house instead? Fitch didn't sugarcoat it. She said that was why Colin had to keep his pattern predictable to police and unpredictable to the watcher. She told him to avoid driving home directly afterward, to vary his route, and to keep his phone location settings strict. It sounded like advice from a world Colin never wanted to enter, yet it was also the world he had already entered the moment the media case disappeared. Colin didn't feel brave. He felt cornered. Still, being cornered with a plan is different than being cornered alone. In the hours before the meet, Colin did a careful thing that felt almost absurd. He prepared a decoy binder. Fitch had explained that people who demand objects rarely care what's inside at first. They care about possession and leverage. So Colin assembled a plain folder with printed photos of the unit, a copy of his auction receipt and blank inventory sheets, then sealed it inside a zip bag and taped the bag shut like evidence. It was convincing enough at a glance, and useless enough not to harm anyone. He also put together a second folder for Fitch, containing everything real he could legally share without breaking into the sealed notebook's content. The timestamps, the gate log screenshots Maribel printed, the photos of the missing space where the media case had been, and the screenshot of the text. Colin was used to paperwork being a burden. Now it was a shield. He ate half a sandwich he couldn't taste, drank coffee he didn't want, and sat in his truck for 10 minutes before leaving because his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He thought of Sophie at the neighbor's house laughing at a movie he didn't know, and he held that image like a rope. This wasn't about greed or drama. It was about making sure his kid didn't learn the lesson that good people get punished for stumbling into the wrong secret. The facility at dusk felt different than it did at noon, colder and thinner. The sky fading into a flat winter gray that made metal doors look even more alike. The office still had lights on, and renters were still coming and going, but the lane noise had softened into fewer voices and more echo. Colin parked where the cameras had the best angle, exactly as Fitch instructed, and he carried the sealed tote like it was heavier than it was. He walked to Unit 207 with a steady pace that cost him effort, rolled the door up halfway, and placed the tote just inside the threshold where it could be seen from the lane, but not grabbed without stepping into camera view. He stood with his phone in his hand, not calling anyone, not messaging, just waiting as if he were doing boring inventory work. Fitch was there without being there, positioned near a different row with a clipboard in her hand like another renter checking a list. The uniformed officer was closer to the office, visible enough to remind anyone watching that the facility wasn't an empty stage. Colin's heart pounded anyway, because fear doesn't care how smart your plan is. A few cars passed. A man loaded a lamp into a trunk. Someone laughed near the gate, and for a moment Colin wondered if the watcher would sense the trap and stay away, leaving him with nothing but an anxious night and no new answers. Then a dark SUV rolled in slow, the same patient movement he had noticed earlier, turning too cleanly, stopping too neatly, parking in a way that gave it a straight view down the lane. A man stepped out, older than Colin expected, wearing a plain jacket and a cap that shadowed his face just enough to hide expression while still looking harmless. He didn't rush, and he didn't shout. He walked like someone who believed politeness was a weapon, and he stopped several yards from the unit, as if distance made him reasonable. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said, voice low and steady, not loud enough to draw curious ears, but clear enough to press. Colin didn't answer with anger, because anger is a handle people grab. He said one sentence, slow and even, the way he spoke to Sophie when she tested boundaries. "Everything I touched is documented." The man smiled without warmth and nodded toward the tote just inside the door. "That's not what I asked for," he said, and his eyes flicked to Colin's phone as if he already knew Colin was recording. He took one step closer, then another, and when he crossed the line into camera view, Fitch shifted, the clipboard lowering, her badge appearing like a quiet light turning on. The officer moved at the same time, not running, not tackling, just closing the space with calm authority. The man froze, then tried to pivot back toward his SUV, but the lane behind him filled with a slow-moving pickup that blocked his angle out, and suddenly his careful control had nowhere to go. Fitch's voice stayed firm and plain as she told him to keep his hands visible and step away from the unit. For a second, Colin saw the crack in the man's composure, the flash of irritation that proved the politeness had always been a mask, and then the man exhaled and complied, because the moment had stopped being private. The shock didn't come from handcuffs or shouting. It came from what Fitch found when she spoke to him quietly by the office, out of the lane's echo. The man didn't admit to stealing the media case, at least not in words, but he talked the way people talk when they believe you're already trapped by knowledge. He said the drives were complicated, that the binder belonged to a recovery project, and that Colin had no idea what he was holding. Fitch kept asking direct questions, and the man kept circling around the same point. He wanted the map, the index, the structure that explained what had been collected and why. When Fitch mentioned the safe deposit box on Ridge Avenue, the man's eyes narrowed in a brief, sharp way that made Colin's blood run cold, because it confirmed the earlier note's threat wasn't a guess. The police didn't need a confession in that moment. They needed enough to justify the next step. They detained him for questioning related to trespass, unauthorized access tools, and harassment, and they documented his vehicle in place. Colin watched on the edge of the office doorway, trying to keep his face neutral, and felt an ugly mix of relief and nausea. Relief, because he hadn't walked into a dark meeting like prey. Nausea, because the watcher had been close enough to study his routines and still felt entitled to demand more. When Fitch returned to Colin, she didn't tell him everything was over, because she wasn't selling comfort. She told him they had stopped one pressure point, and now they had to see what else moved when that point was removed. The wave hit as Colin was about to leave, because Maribel stepped out of the back office, holding a printed sheet with her hands slightly unsteady. She had been digging through old facility records at Fitch's request, cross-checking names, payment patterns, and the legacy fobs list, and she found something that made her swallow hard. The previous renter of Unit 207 had listed an emergency contact years ago, then updated it once and never again, and the contact name matched a local address still on file. Maribel didn't read it aloud in front of everyone. She slid it to Fitch like it was fragile. Fitch looked at it, then at Colin, and her tone changed into something more careful. "This is how we find the human part," she said quietly. "Not the thieves. The owner." Colin's throat tightened, because he had been thinking about culprits and threats, and he hadn't let himself think too hard about the person who wrote. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back." Fitch told him they would follow the record with proper steps, because showing up on a doorstep with a story like this can do harm if you do it wrong. She also told him something else that landed like a stone. The detained man wasn't carrying the media case in his vehicle, which meant the drives were already elsewhere, and whoever took them might not be the same person who showed up tonight. Colin nodded, feeling the air thin in his lungs, because it meant the problem wasn't one man and one meeting. It was a small network, and networks don't stop because one link gets pulled. Colin drove to pick up Sophie with his hands still steady but his mind running hot, and he forced his voice into normal shapes when she climbed into the passenger seat and asked if his paperwork mess was done. He told her it was handled for now, and she accepted that the way kids of single parents accept a lot, without liking it, without demanding details, because they can read exhaustion like a language. At home, after she went to bed, Colin sat at the kitchen table and stared at the safe deposit box key lying beside his receipts, because he could feel the story pulling toward its real center. The unit wasn't only about money or lost property. It was about why someone built a careful archive of strangers' belongings and then vanished, and why someone else was willing to trespass and threaten to control what that archive contained. His phone buzzed once more near midnight, and his stomach tightened so hard it felt like a cramp, but it wasn't another demand. It was a message from Detective Fitch with a single photo attached, a close-up of an evidence tag from the detained man's pocket. Written on the tag in neat block letters were 3 words that made Colin's skin prickle, because they matched the sealed notebook's first sentence too perfectly to ignore. For the next one, Colin stared at the screen until his eyes burned, because it meant the person who built the system had planned for a successor, and someone out there was desperate to make sure that successor wasn't him. After Fitch's message, Colin forced the story into daylight and paperwork, not bravery. He met Detective Sloan Fitch at the Ridge Street Bank, opened a safe deposit box under cameras and a clerk's witness, and handed over the index binder and sealed notebook, so every page could be photographed and logged before anyone read a word. When Fitch cut the plastic, the notebook finally explained the metal case wall in plain, tired language. Its owner, Jasper Wynn, had been consolidating legally purchased unclaimed freight lots from brokers, separating claim tag serial items meant for carriers from salvage meant for resale, and archiving personal belongings because official channels moved too slowly, all while illness shortened his timeline and left the unit as a handoff for the next one. That clarity let Fitch shift the pressure into a real case. The intimidation crew wasn't chasing treasure. They were chasing information, and the stolen media case mattered because it was leverage. Gate logs, old fob records, and camera clips became evidence, while the carrier and broker contacts in Jasper's notes produced the only thing Colin needed: clean rules for a control return and a clearance letter. Colin also met Jasper's sister, Kendra Wynn, in the storage office lobby with cameras and a witness, returned the return tote, drawings, school photos, a plush toy, the Nana tin, and received a notarized custodian statement Jasper had prepared to protect a lien buyer who did the right steps. The carrier recovery handoff happened in daylight with clipboards and serial lists, and it felt like the first moment the danger stopped breathing down Colin's neck. The team reclaimed tagged electronics and hard cases, signed receipts, and issued a written clearance confirming Colin acted as a cooperative custodian. Fitch later confirmed the stolen drives had been cloned and secured after a warrant, keeping the heat on the right people and away from Colin's home and his daughter's life. With the broker release in hand, Colin finally knew what he could sell without looking over his shoulder. Over the next weeks, he sold only cleared salvage through channels that left receipts, refused cash today offers, and turned the proceeds into real stability. Overdue utilities paid, the car fixed, an emergency fund built, and Sophie's tutoring covered without panic. By New Year's, the house looked the same from the street, but sounded different inside. Fewer whispered calculations, more ordinary laughter, and Colin understood the ending wasn't the cases or the money. It was that he handled the heavy box slowly, honestly, with witnesses, and that choice brought his kid a future that didn't depend on luck. Colin didn't let the ending be only about money, either. A week after the clearance letter, he and Sophie spent a Saturday morning sorting the low-value, personal items the detective returned. Scarves, keychains, souvenir pins, a few unopened postcards, into small, labeled bundles. He brought them to the community center's lost and found board with printed photos and a simple claim process Fitch approved, because Jasper's whole system had been built around dignity, not spectacle. When an older man showed up and recognized a veteran's pin he'd lost on a bus 2 winters ago, Colin watched the man's hand shake as he held it again, and that quiet gratitude landed harder than any sale ever could. Kendra called once in late January, not to ask for more, but to tell Colin that Jasper's daughter had found the crayon drawings in a shoebox and taped one to her bedroom door like a flag. Kendra's voice cracked only on the last sentence, when she said Jasper had always worried the unit would become a curse instead of bridge, and that Colin had proven it didn't have to. Colin didn't say much back, because there are moments where words feel like they cheapen the thing. But after the call, he pulled Sophie close for a second longer than usual and felt a knot in his chest loosen in a way it hadn't since the first unknown caller rang. By early spring, the garage looked less like a panic warehouse and more like a small, honest operation. Colin kept a ledger on a clipboard, took photos before every sale, and met buyers in public places, while Sophie helped him fold coats and check box corners for damage like it was a game with rules. The emergency fund sat untouched in a separate account, and the simple fact that it existed changed how he slept. He no longer woke up already losing arguments with numbers. He didn't pretend life turned easy overnight, but he noticed how steadiness spreads. One repaired car means fewer missed shifts. Fewer missed shifts means fewer late fees. Fewer late fees means a little room to plan instead of react. On the last night of the school year, Sophie came home with a certificate tucked carefully into her backpack, the paper slightly bent but her smile straight and bright. Colin taped it to the fridge beside her drawings and a new calendar that had fewer red circles than the one he used to dread. Outside, neighbors were lighting sparklers left over from New Year's, and the air smelled like cut grass and warm pavement, instead of cold metal and packing tape. Colin stood in the doorway and realized the real luxury he bought with that unit wasn't what was inside the cases. It was a future where his kid could make plans without asking first whether the heat bill would cancel them.